Okay, so as part of this course I've been teaching on interpersonal, culturistic, and relational psychoanalysis, I included an evening on the thought of Erik Erikson. So perhaps the best place to start with Erikson is with the issue of his name. Back in the 70s, there was a critical article by Marshall Berman, I think it was in the New York Review of Books, attacking Erikson as what has been called a father-ablator. This is sort of related to Norman O'Brown's idea of the causa sui project. Causa sui, the cause of myself. No father, cause of myself. A father-ablator is someone who wants to eliminate any debt that he might owe to a father. So Erikson changes his name. In his early publications, his name was listed as Erik Hamburger Erikson. He drops the Hamburger, and he becomes Erikson, Erik's son. So there was a lot of confusion about his paternity. His mother married Hamburger, Jewish man. At some point, Erikson learns that Hamburger is not his actual father, and he confronts the mother, and she claims that that's right, he was fathered by her previous husband, Salmonson. And then sometime later, Erikson discovers that that too is a lie, and the mother will never tell him who the real father was, and Erikson imagines that it may well have been a Danish Christian man. His mother and Hamburger are small and dark. Erikson himself is tall and blonde, and he overhears whisperings among relatives, questioning his paternity. He's mocked by people in the community. So no wonder he becomes a writer about identity and identity crisis and identity diffusion. To make things a bit more complicated, in this Jewish family, Erikson's mother was apparently a passionate reader of Søren Kierkegaard, a passionate Christian, and she encourages her son to read Kierkegaard. He later marries Joan Surson, who was a Canadian, actually, Canadian Anglican. He goes on to write books about Luther, Ghandi, and Daniel Burstyn, in his book on Erik Erikson and the American Psyche, argues against Berman that Erikson, far from being a father-ablator, was a father-seeker, seeking a father in Luther, in Ghandi, and in Jesus, another man of somewhat uncertain parentage. Late in his career, he writes a very interesting essay called The Galilean Sayings and the Sense of I, Yale Review, 1987. The Galilean Sayings, the sayings of Jesus. So a father seeker rather than a father ablater. Of course, he finds a father in Sigmund Freud. He did not have a university education. He didn't have a university degree. He went on to be a professor at Harvard and Yale. He dropped out. He became a kind of artist wanderer. I guess if he'd been living in the 1960s as a young person, he would have been a hippie, part of the counterculture perhaps. His friend Peter Bloss comes to be associated with Dorothy Burlingham and Anna Freud. They are trying to establish a school for the children of psychoanalysts, and Bloss draws Erikson into this project. Erikson had at some point acquired Montessori teacher training, and so he's drawn into this Freud circle and kind of adopted by them. And he is analyzed by Anna Freud, trained by her, and becomes a child psychoanalyst. So this is his family, and this gives him an identity, and he's very grateful for this, and the result is that he writes in a way that is always extremely deferential and polite towards the Freudian family, and this obscures the depth and the extent of his quite penetrating criticism of Freudian thought. You have to read Erikson pretty carefully to become aware of how profound his criticism is, and how far he's really moved away from Freud's vision toward a much more relational and social and cultural and historical understanding of the human situation. He certainly deserves, I think, to be seen as part of the cultural, relational perspective. So he writes about identity. Childhood and Society in 1950. Very important book covering a whole range of topics, including not just the anthropological and the sociological and the historical and the cultural themes that he brings in, but there are also several interesting clinical case studies in Childhood and Society, such as the case of the little boy who suffered from severe constipation. And he hadn't had a bowel movement in many, many days, and his stomach was distended and he was uncomfortable. The parents had tried every kind of medication. Nothing was working. It looked like they may have to have some kind of surgical intervention, but before doing this, they decide to try Erikson's child therapy. So Erikson sees the boy, and then he arranges to come to the home, and he goes to the boy's room with the little boy, and he gets the boy to tell him about his favorite storybook, and which has something to do with, if I remember correctly, a train being stuck in a tunnel. And he learns that the boy's mother has recently been pregnant, and the little boy watched her tummy getting bigger and bigger, and he got the idea something was growing in Mummy's tummy, and he got that all confused with poo, and he thought that Mummy must have to be very, very careful when she's going to the toilet, because what's inside her tummy might come out and be flushed away. And it becomes evident to Erikson that this little boy thinks he's pregnant, and that he can't let go because something very valuable might be lost. So he explains to the little boy that he's a boy, that he can't get pregnant, that there's no living being in there, it's just poop, and he leaves. And then later that day he hears from the parents that the plumbers are at work attempting to unplug the toilet. His intervention was obviously pretty successful. That story, I think, inspired a lot of readers to want to become psychoanalysts or child therapists. So he is a clinician, but he is also a historian, an anthropologist, a sociologist, and brings these themes in a big way. He was particularly concerned with identity, with the formation of ego identity, and with the themes of identity crisis and identity diffusion. If one fails to establish a stable ego identity, which is the major task of stage 5 of his epigenetic sequence, identity versus role confusion or identity diffusion. It's interesting that Otto Kernberg takes from Erikson this concept of identity diffusion, the failure to establish stable ego identity, and he makes it one of the central defining characteristics of the borderline personality. Brings it into the borderline diagnosis, identity diffusion. In today's complex society, it is very difficult for young people to form a stable ego identity. There are so many possibilities, so many choices. Erikson recommended what he called a psychosocial moratorium for youth, roughly corresponding to the years of university and perhaps a bit longer and earlier, obviously. By a psychosocial moratorium, he means exemption of the young person from the demand to present a coherent identity, a time for identity exploration, trying on this, trying on that, switching from Marxism to Christianity to anarchism to whatever. Exploration, a time of exemption from strict claims to have a cohesive identity. Because to form ego identity is such a complex task. In Erikson's view, what it involves is trying to work out a synthesis and trying to order or to organize the many self-images from each of the earlier stages of development, from infancy, early childhood, later childhood, latency, adolescence. Somehow, at all of these stages, we form self-images, and somehow or other we have to bring all of these different senses of self into some sort of cohesive order. But that's not enough. That's only step one. In order to have stable ego identity, and here the interpersonal and cultural element comes in for Erikson, that order that we have managed to arrange has to receive validation. It has to receive social recognition. It has to receive social confirmation by the surrounding society in order to be stabilized. Okay. Erikson was acutely, empathically attuned to the problems then of young people, issues of identity crisis and identity diffusion. Nowadays, disturbed adolescents are all too quickly diagnosed and medicated, as distinct from the kind of careful psychosocial exploration with the young person that Erikson advocated and practiced. For some years he was at the Austin Riggs Center, and he was there with his wife Joan Serson, who was an occupational therapist. They worked together. It's pretty clear that the Eriksons represented a pattern that's actually pretty common. A couple of creative people, and the woman, the wife, makes a very major contribution, but the husband gets all of the credit. It's hard to tell how much of Erikson's theory comes from Erikson and how much comes from Joan. Certainly, Joan Erikson adds a ninth stage to the famous 8 stages that Erikson offers, 3 beyond the 5 that Freud gave us. She adds a ninth, which I'll come to in a minute. Before I turn to the issue of the 8 or the 9 stages of development, I just want to point out the issue of zones and modes. Okay, Freud is a zone theorist. He sees our drives as emanating from somatic zones. The drive is defined by aim, object, pressure, and source. These are not animal instincts, they're human drives, but Freud insists they arise from bodily zones. The oral zone, the anal zone, the phallic, genital zone. These are the 3 zones Freud gives us. He then gives us 2 other stages, latency and then genitality. Erikson adds on 3 more, youth, identity versus identity diffusion, and then early adulthood, generativity versus stagnation, and then finally the 8th stage, integrity versus despair, and then Joan adds on the 9th stage, which is called gero-transcendence, as in gerontology, gero-transcendence. But Erikson is not content to see our social relations as grounded in somatic sources, somatic zones. He, in fact, reverses Freud's thinking here, and he sees development as involving different modes of relatedness. So that in the oral phase, the modes are active incorporative and passive incorporative modes of relating, to get or to take. These are ways of relating to people. And he sees these modes of relating as employing the body. The body, rather than being the source, is merely a vehicle through which social relations occur. As a part of this, there's quite a critique, an explicit critique in Childhood and Society of what Erikson sees as Freud's centaur model of man. We know the mythical beast, the centaur, with the head and torso of a man and the body of a horse. Here Erikson, in his quiet way, is being quite critical of the mind-body, culture-nature, human-beast hybrid that Freud gives us. Superego and ego on the human side, trying to tame and control the beast, civilization, trying to tame the beast. In Freud's thinking, our sociality is an add-on. It's a layer superimposed upon our animality. All of this is fundamentally incorrect for Erikson, but he says so politely one can barely notice the critique of Freud's thinking that is being offered here. I mean, here's a man with great uncertainty about paternity who finds a father in Freud and something of a mother in Anna Freud and a family among the Freudians, and here he is offering critique, but boy, he's doing so very gently. Okay, so it's been pointed out that probably Erik Erikson and Erich Fromm are probably the two most widely read psychoanalysts, or were for a long time, the two most widely read psychoanalysts other than Freud himself. That was 30 years ago or more. Who reads Fromm and Erikson today? Well, there's a Fromm revival going on during the past few years. Maybe it's over time for an Erikson revival. So he expands from Freud's 5 stages to 8 and then 9. Oral, anal, phallic, Oedipal, latency, genital, youth, young adulthood, old age. At each of these stages, there is a central conflict and a central task. In the oral phase, the task is basic trust or mistrust, which kind of overlaps with Melanie Klein's thinking in many ways. For Klein, the task of the first year of life is and a task that is continually having to be redone, the internalization of a whole good object with which one can identify and develop a whole good sense of self. This is Erikson's way of getting at this, is to say that the task of the first year of life really is to establish basic trust in the goodness of the world. When you're hungry, there may be a wait, it may be frustrating, but sooner or later the breast arrives, or the bottle arrives, whether it's held by father or mother. The world responds, and the world is fundamentally good, and the self is fundamentally good. That's basic trust. When the early caretaking breaks down, we're left with basic mistrust. Second stage, autonomy versus shame and doubt. Do we develop confidence in our separate selves, that we can manage our bodies, or are we left with shame and doubt about our capacities to function and to self-control and self-regulate? The third stage, Oedipal stage, phallic Oedipal stage, initiative versus guilt. Can we initiate? Can we take initiatives to seek pleasure without being crippled by guilt? Can we manifest aggression when necessary without having to inhibit and be crushed by guilt? This is the central task of the phallic Oedipal stage. Latency, identity versus, industry versus inferiority. Industry versus inferiority. Can we mobilize our powers? Can we learn how to work? Can we learn how to achieve? Can we meet expectations and find a degree of success, or are we left crushed by a feeling of inferiority and inadequacy, latency? Adolescence, identity versus role confusion, or identity diffusion. We've already spoken of this. The sixth stage, youth, young adulthood, intimacy versus isolation. Can we establish successful, loving relationships with others? Or do we retreat from others into varying states of isolation? Adulthood, generativity versus stagnation. Generativity doesn't have to be biological, take the form of biological parenting. One can generate a poem. One can generate a house. One can generate a novel or a painting. One can generate children. The point is to be able to generate something beyond ourselves, to be interested in the world beyond the self, and to be able to contribute to it, versus stagnation. And then in the eighth stage, old age, integrity versus despair. Integrity involving having achieved an integration of the self and of one's capacities from all of the earlier stages. The failure to be able to achieve this kind of integration is the kind of despair that we see in some bitter old people who feel that they have failed to develop themselves and their capacities. To this, in their 80s, Erik and Joan come to recognize the need for a ninth stage, gero-transcendence. I'll come to the transcendence part of this in a minute, but basically what they're saying is that in the late stages of life, later old age, there is devolution. I mean, through all of these 8 stages, we've been looking at the evolution of the self. But in late old age, there is devolution. All of these positive attainments, that is, the ability to embrace the positive solution to the conflict, all of this now is unwinding. It's all coming undone. The person is falling apart. The person is moving towards death. Having achieved basic trust versus mistrust, the person is now facing a lot of mistrust. I mean, for one thing, he can't trust his body because his body is breaking down in one way or another. Autonomy versus shame and doubt. Well, forget about autonomy. One is breaking down. One is becoming increasingly dependent. One may no longer be able to even manage bathroom functions without assistance. One may wind up in diapers again. One may not be able to navigate. One has to depend on caretakers. So the shame that is involved in this as people age, the loss. My old mentor Eli Sagan once said to me, "Don, do you want to know the secret of aging?" And I said, "Sure, Eli." He said, "It's loss, and it's more loss." And this is what the Eriksons are getting at. Third stage, initiative versus guilt. A lot of initiatives can't be taken anymore. One's sex life may have to come to an end. All kinds of other initiatives may no longer be feasible. Industry versus inferiority. One may no longer have the energy to be able to be industrious or to have the capacities necessary for that. Identity versus role diffusion. Well, I mean, one retires and one gives up the identity that one may have had and enjoyed for decades. And now there is the park bench and the pigeons. Not necessarily. Obviously, there are many things, many forms of identity that creative older people find after retirement. But as the aging process continues, a lot of these identities are no longer sustainable, and a kind of identity diffusion and role confusion comes into the picture. Intimacy versus isolation. Well, your spouse may die. Your friends are dying around you. You're becoming increasingly isolated. All of this can lead to increasing self-doubt, and it can lead to the despair encountered by many older people. So this is a story of devolution rather than evolution. But the Eriksons postulate the possibility of attaining, despite all of this, what they call gero-transcendence. Gerontology, the study of the aging. Gero-transcendence, a kind of transcendence achieved by some people at the end of life, which is essentially, as I understand it, the ability to look back and say, well, you know, I've had a good life. I have achieved many things. I have loved. I have been creative. All in all, it's been good enough. And I'm tired. And it's getting to be closing time. The title of a wonderful song by Canadian singer-songwriter, Closing Time. If you've had a really good meal, sometimes, you know, you decide to push away from the table. It's enough already. And I think this is the kind of attitude that the Eriksons are referring to with this concept of gero-transcendence. Erikson's theory is an epigenetic theory. Just as the fetus on a biological level goes through distinct stages in its development in utero, so human beings go through distinct stages. I mean, Freud himself was an epigenetic thinker. Erikson certainly is. This is evolutionary thinking. And both Freud and certainly Erikson are also dialectical thinkers. It's always a matter of facing a particular conflict and finding a solution which enables one to move on to the next stage, where one encounters thesis, antithesis, moving to synthesis. The synthesis becoming the new thesis, giving rise to an antithesis, giving rise to a higher synthesis. This is the way evolution progresses. Another important aspect of Erikson's thinking is that successful accomplishment of each of these tasks gives rise to a particular virtue. The achievement of basic trust over basic mistrust gives rise to the virtue of hope. And each of these stages, if successfully mastered, gives rise to a virtue. And this is an aspect of Erikson's thinking that has been attacked. It was attacked by both Paul Rosen and Marshall Berman. They see Erikson as trying to bring values and ethics back into psychoanalysis, values that they think psychoanalysis, in the work of Freud, had properly transcended. They see this as a regressive move on Erikson's part to smuggle values back into psychoanalysis in this way. I think, in fact, what Erikson is doing is not smuggling anything back in, but simply revealing the values that have always been there, implicitly and hidden, because Freud wanted psychoanalysis to not be seen as the ethical practice that it is. He wanted it to be seen as a biomedical process, whereas in fact it's grounded in ethical values. Erikson has simply made this explicit. One of the very few psychoanalysts to make it explicit. Again, there's a parallel here with Erich Fromm. Fromm is quite explicit about the values underlying psychoanalytic practice. Okay, Erikson situates us in history and in culture. He was associated with the so-called culture and personality school of social anthropology and sociology that was quite prominent in the 1940s, 50s, into the 60s. He associated with people like the anthropologists Edward Sapir, Margaret Mead, Gregory Bateson, Clyde Kluckhohn. At Parsons, at Harvard, he knew Talcott Parsons, who also was interested in assimilating psychoanalysis into sociology. He actually did some anthropological field work himself. The Yurok, and again, there's an implicit criticism of Freud here. The Yurok, Indians of northern California, northwestern California, have a particular type of character. That culture and personality school, we're interested in linking the dominant character type of a particular society or era to particular child-rearing methods that they thought generated the kind of character that the society wanted to implant or evoke in people. So the Yurok display a kind of obsessive-compulsive character, which according to Freudian theory would mean that there was some conflict and fixation in the anal phase. Erikson reveals this as a culturally relative phenomenon because, in fact, although they have an obsessive-compulsive character, this does not seem to be related to anality among the Yurok. They make no fuss about toilet training whatsoever. They simply leave kids alone, and sooner or later the kids start emulating the adults, and they start urinating and defecating in the way that the adults do, and no one makes a fuss of teaching them about this. It just kind of is allowed to evolve. But on the other hand, the Yurok are quite obsessive and have many rules governing food intake and what you can eat and the way and the when of when eating is to take place. So it seems that the production of an obsessive compulsive character is not specifically related to anything anal or anything oral. It's related to the culture surrounding certain kinds of bodily functions with strict rules and rituals. So Erikson has a profound sense of how the culture shapes the evolution of personality by intervening with particular child-rearing methods. And he has a sense, again, of how historical location, being located in a particular time and place, influences personality development. Again, we can compare Erich Fromm, who is engaged in the same kind of characterological study. For example, Fromm associates early industrial capitalism, where people are pressed to save and to invest, leading to a particular kind of exploitative and hoarding character type, whereas when we move into late capitalism, consumer capitalism, people are pressed to enjoy, consume, and the marketing character evolves, a person who markets himself, who evolves a self that and invests in a self that can be marketed and sold. Erikson was critical of Freud's theory of the superego. He saw Freud as giving us a concept of a negative, harsh, critical conscience, superego. Erikson wanted to balance this with a positive conscience, an encouraging, supportive, forgiving conscience to offset the critical superego. He tried to find this in Freud's concept of the ego ideal. As I've pointed out, in 1923, in The Ego and the Id, Freud folds both conscience and ego ideal into superego, and so we lose the concepts of conscience and ego ideal as separate concepts. They're swallowed up in the superego. Erikson tries to bring ego ideal back and to treat it as the positive conscience, as distinct from the critical superego. I agree entirely with Erikson's sense of the need for this and of his critique of the Freudian superego, but his attempt to find a positive conscience in the ego ideal just won't work, because Erikson didn't sufficiently notice that when I'm measuring my real ego against my ego ideal, my mind is entirely on myself. This is a narcissistic project. And if I try to parent in such a way that I can live up to my ideal of good parenting, that's very different from the kind of good parenting that flows from simply loving your child. And the child can certainly tell the difference. The patient can certainly tell the difference as to whether the analyst is behaving in line with the good analyst textbook, or whether the analyst is genuinely caring about the welfare of his patient. The way I put it recently is, if as an analyst I don't sleep with my patients because it's against the rules and I might get caught and punished, that's very different from me not sleeping with patients because I know that would harm them and I care about them, and I'm not going to do anything that would harm them because I'm about helping them. So the former comes from the superego, the latter, the caring, comes from the conscience. Erikson tried to find that in the ego ideal. It won't work. Ego ideal is a narcissistic structure. We need a separate concept of conscience, but I've argued that in many other places. Erikson's book on Luther, young man Luther, brilliant study of Martin Luther, who had this crisis because Luther had a savagely severe superego because he had a father who beat him. And so he develops this harsh conception of God as a severe father, and he becomes a monk, and he is praying and depriving himself, and he's into scrupulosity, scrupulous, obsessive, compulsive adherence to rules and rituals in order to win the Father's love and forgiveness and salvation and redemption, to please the Father God. And it reaches such a frenzy that finally he has a breakdown in the choir. And out of this breakdown comes a breakthrough. It was R.D. Laing who talked about how sometimes breakdown is breakthrough. It was a breakthrough for Luther, who breaks out of this conception of God as the harsh critic and moves towards a God who offers us forgiveness and salvation as a simple free gift. This is the doctrine of grace, salvation by faith and by grace, the receiving of forgiveness as God's free gift through Jesus Christ. This is the Protestant Reformation. Luther stands there at the Diet of Worms and says, "Here I stand, I can do no other." So this is this distinction between the superego God and the God who is not about rules is certainly there in the New Testament. It's certainly there in St. Paul. Luther simply recovers this fundamental distinction, and this is really the distinction between the superego and the conscience. The conscience grounded in love, superego really grounded in aggression turned against the self. Salvation by faith and by grace. Faith not being a matter of adherence to propositions as in catechisms. Faith in the Old Testament sense of faith as trust, and now we're back to Erikson and basic trust again.